I'd just like to welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is Lisa. I'm the Project Policy Officer here at FRSA. And yeah, we're really pleased to have you guys all come out to listen to our presentation today as we explore the longitudinal study of Indigenous children and how it's being used to tell powerful stories about what helps Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children grow up strong. Just before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm coming from, which is Ngunnawal land here in Canberra. And I'd like to pay my respects to Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land and recognise any other people or families with connections to the lands of the ACT and surrounding region. As this is a national webinar, I'd also just like to recognise the traditional custodians of the lands and waters right across Australia and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd like to extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are coming along to this webinar today. So back in May in Sydney, we had the FRSA National Conference 2025, and we had a number of great presentations that were led or co-developed with First Nations people, and we're really enjoying getting to revisit some of these presentations through this lunchtime seminar series. The webinar series is a chance for us really just to reflect further on those practice insights that have been shared at conference and to keep building our collective learning. So it's just really great. And so I haven't seen this presentation, so I'm super excited to see this one today. And just to highlight that we will have some question time at the end. So if you do have any questions, pop them into the chat and we'll just try and get to as many of those questions as we possibly can at the end of the presentation. So today's presentation is called Growing Up Strong from Early Childhood Stories and Other Findings from Footprints in Time, the Longitudinal Study of Indigenous Children. And we're going to explore how the study is being used in new and powerful ways. And our presenters will share how Indigenous knowledge, storytelling methods and data can come together to tell meaningful stories about what helps children to grow up strong. We'll hear how the researchers are using a strengths-based approach grounded in Indigenous conceptions of social and emotional wellbeing and to bring the findings of this study to life. So today we're really fortunate to be joined by Associate Professor Stuart Ekberg. I'm going to pronounce your name wrong again.
That's sorry. Completely fine. Keep it
Tirritpa.
Yes.
Ritchie, who are both from Flinders University, and Professor Kristin Lawrence from Queensland University of Technology, who will guide us through this work and share the insights about culture, place and family and how these elements support wellbeing and can inform better services and stronger communities. So without further ado, I'll just hand over to Stuart, Tirritpa and Kristin to take us through their presentation.
Thank you. Cheers, Lisa. Thank you for having us all today. I also like to just switch languages here just quickly. Nakanari Tirritpa Kunicha, Ganiata Edidiata, Irindiaka, Nakanandaya Nacha, Imparenti Yata. Just acknowledging country which I'm on today, the lands of the Kaurna people, and acknowledging the various lands in which you're all joining in today, and acknowledging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present as well. Thank you. I'll do a brief introduction for myself, and then as we get through the slides, Stuart and Kristin can do their own introductions as well. But my name is Tirritpa Ritchie. Like I said, I'm a Kaurna man and an occupational therapist, and had a fantastic opportunity to join in this research project looking at the longitudinal study for Indigenous children, and bringing, I guess, my aspect to it was around the Indigenous methodologies and supporting, ways of speaking to some of this data. But let's keep going. To the next slide, Stuart. So this is an overview of our research team with our lead, Stephen Rogers, who is a Rotary academic, and Kristin Lawrence, who's joining us as well here today. We're very fortunate to have Kristin join in and give a component of the research as well. Stuart as well, who is a Western Islander man, and we were also joined by non-Indigenous researchers as well, Kate Williams from USC, Donna Berthelston from QUT, Emma Carpendale from QUT, and Lauren Pilch from QUT as well. So we had a mix of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal academics with various professional knowledges and backgrounds in this team. We also were very fortunate to get Kylie Monteleone for the artist, and it's a Western Islander woman, for some of the artwork that you will see throughout the report, which we can bring up a little bit today and speak to that as well. So we had a great diverse team in bringing to life some of this data. To give you an overview of the longitudinal study of Indigenous children, in which there are over 1,700 children, and by extension, their families and parents and communities as well involved in the actual study. And you can see on the map on the right of the various locations all over the country from which the children were joined in, so the 11 different areas. This longitudinal study went over a period of 14 years, and so during that time, the children and families moved to various parts of the country. You can see the broad spectrum or diversity and the movement, and so the data that we were seeing reflected some of these experiences of growing up in various locations in city, metropolitan, out of regional, rural, and remote as well. And this is an ongoing study, and there are still more years being collected and released. And we're going to be focusing on one aspect of this time period for this presentation. So in eliciting some of this research and some of the things that we were able to the data and information that we were able to be privileged enough to work with, the study employed community-based researchers, which you can see here in the picture in the right-hand corner. The research administration officers, these RAOs, are really crucial and important to collecting the data with the families and families' experiences of reporting the relationships and the closeness with these research administration officers to tell their stories and provide information about their experiences with their families. And so we'd like to acknowledge the important work that the RAOs, the role that they played. So within the conversations in which they elicit this information, they were able to have conversations around what helps Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children grow up strong. This study is governed by a steering committee with majority Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members and leaderships. RAOs represented on that, but various expertise and knowledges as well. And Glenda Griffiths is one of the chairs for the steering committees, who has a fantastic academic pedigree in Indigenous governance and data sovereignty, and so we're steered by an amazing team and governance network to be able to engage and do some of this work. And so Indigenous governance being brought into the structure to allow us to kind of do the work that we're doing here. Let's move on to the next slide. And here is a bit of an insight into the report and the artwork that I mentioned previously around from Kylie Monteleone. And so we've got a couple of fact sheets here as well in the report itself. And Stuart, you're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure if this QR code is currently working. No, it's not. But hopefully we can share the report or links to the report later. But this is fantastic to share some of the resources, and we've got fact sheets as well to be able to summarize some of the information presented as well. And so we've got this wonderful mixture of qualitative and quantitative data and sharing stories, which we'll go into a little bit more depth and detail. But before we do, let's go to the next slide. And so just to highlight some of the sections within the report, but also highlighting some of the ways in which we were showing some of this information. Kylie Montielini's artwork and creation of this was fantastic to bring to life some of these stories. And so each of the particular chapters has associated artwork for that period of growing up strong, or linking to various relevant iconography or artwork and creation of this. And so, as you can see, each of the things on the left-hand side is connected to the content of the actual report. And so, where chapter 4, for example, growing up strong, was talking about bush medicine and bush tucker as a theme within that. And so we have the artwork connected to that, and bringing to life further some of these stories as well. All right, okay. This was a great piece of media publication that was great to highlight within the Cape York Weekly, in which you can just bring it from the first paragraph there, where we're talking about the community already knows. So a recent study of Aboriginal Trust Island children revealed what most of the Cape already knows in early connections to country, language and mob are critical in shaping preschool and play groups and shaping well-beings for success. And so it was great to have this almost feedback from the communities in which we're trying to work, and we're seeing that this is information and knowledge about growing up strong that they are well aware of, and then it's our job to bring in the data, or bringing this to life in the report, to be able to share these strengths and experiences from community. And so we're able to provide this to help shape and guide policies and approaches as well. And so highlighting the strengths of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and learnings, and how they can carry this into every aspect of life, and trying to keep that culturally centered and strengths-based approach. And so it's great to see that reflected in the story within a media release as well. Just keep moving on. Okay, so a bit of the process of how we we're telling some of these stories. And so we had the really amazing task to tell stories in which these communities knew, and the strengths and approaches to growing up strong. And so families were participating in LSIC to tell their story. And so we were in a privileged position to be able to almost be custodians and bring out some of these stories. And so we had to do this for a process of adapting these stories through story methodology, and bringing that into the use of longitudinal data. And so we were going through this snippets of small information of data, and bringing broader storying to these snippets of data, which Stuart will talk to in a bit more detail after this. But we were having these specific footprints of journey in life from very early childhood into early adolescence. And so the stories of shifting and changing throughout those key points in time and developmental milestones in particular themes and areas, and the ways in which culture and growing up strong help support it through these various areas. Well, let's move on to the next one, Stuart, and I think this one might be you.
It is. Thanks, Tirritpa. Hi, everyone. My name's Stuart Ekberg. As Lisa mentioned, I'm based at Flinders University here on Kaurna country, and I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna people and their ongoing relationship with the country that I'm currently living and working on. I myself am descended from Western Aranda people of Central Australia and migrant settlers from Sweden, Germany and Britain. And that positions me to work at an interface between Western and Aboriginal knowledge systems. And I've been doing, it's been my great pleasure to do that with Tirritpa, Kristin and our colleagues on this project. One of the things that we have, that's been our joy to discover, is how by working at the intersection of Aboriginal and Western knowledge systems, we've been able to generate really novel ways of working with longitudinal data and extracting insights from those data. And we're going to share both the findings of that today, but also the process that we went through to generate it. And a key first step in that process was stories like this one that we've got here up on this slide, stories that we told with the data that are collected through the longitudinal study and then used to guide our ongoing analysis of that data. So I want to spend a bit of time now with this particular story about someone called Mason, an Aboriginal boy born to a non-Indigenous mother and an Aboriginal father in a regional town. Living with his mother, father and siblings, Mason lives close to country and his mob. When he's a baby, Mason's mum knows that Aboriginal culture will help him grow up strong, connecting him to family, spirituality and ability to live on country. Although his parents sometimes disagree about cultural practices, from a young age, Mason's connected to culture, eating local foods like kangaroo and magpie geese, being taken to meetings and events, spending time on country. Mason's dad knows practices like camping and fishing on country will help Mason know where he comes from. These practices help Mason know his mob, their history and culture. By the time he's a teenager, Mason's mum knows he'll grow up strong by knowing right from wrong and being responsible and respectful. Mason agrees that being focused and knowing what you're doing and not getting caught up with other people if they're doing wrong will help him be strong. So as Tirritpa was saying, this is a type of story that we've been able to tell with information collected from the longitudinal study of Indigenous children. We've pieced together bits of individual information collected over multiple waves or years of data collection, and we've treated those data as footprints in a journey through time and through a life course. And what we're trying to do with those footprints is tell a story like this. But I want to now spend a bit of time showing you exactly how we told that story so you can get a sense of how it came to be. We start with a name. It's a name that we made up, a pseudonym, because as data users, we don't get access to that kind of information about participants. But we can, from the very earliest waves of data collected in the study, know whether they're Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, or both, their gender, details about their family, where they live, the child's connection to country or to a place, their connection to a tribe, language group, or clan. We know from when they're very young what one of their parents thinks will help the child to grow up strong. They were asked this question and their response was recorded. In this case, the response, family, spiritual stuff, out bush, will have survival skills, was information that we weaved into this story. We also know if there were challenges in passing on culture, because this was asked about a few years later. But part of our storying process, we discovered, had to be thinking about what information we were being given, the status of that information, and how we were going to use it. So in this case, the child's non-Indigenous mother reported very specific details about parental disagreement. And when Tirritpa and I yarned about this and subsequently consulted with the Rayos, we became concerned about the use of that information in a story like this, because on the one hand, it may identify the participants, but on the other hand, this was information about men's business that was being spoken about by the child's non-Indigenous mother. So to follow cultural protocols, we decided to weave the response to this question into the story, but in a very generic way. We also made other types of decisions about weaving in additional detail that wasn't in original responses. So for example, there was a question around native ingredients in the child's diet. In this case, we found out about goose. We changed that to magpie geese to really foreground that this element in the child's diet was actually a native ingredient, not one imported from Europe. Later, we get information around how culture is passed on from Mason's Aboriginal father, and much later in Mason's adolescence, we find out what his parents think growing up strong means. But importantly, we also hear from Mason himself about this. And so we can finally weave the child's voice into this story as well. So out of lots of little bits of information, the sorts of things that are routinely collected in longitudinal study methodology, if we can piece these together and start to see them as points in time across someone's life journey. And once we know those points in time, we can start to tell a story about it. When we look at stories like these and listen to them, we can start to understand what's important for a child to grow up strong. Now, this is a story about an individual child, a child that we've called Mason. It has all sorts of particularities to Mason's circumstance and his stories. But as we told and listened to more stories about LSIC children, we started to hear that although there were differences, there were also some very important common threads, and that became critical for what we did next. I want to highlight that very briefly by telling another story about Alira, a Torres Strait Islander girl with a non-Indigenous mother and a Torres Strait Islander father who live with their children in a big city. When Alira's young, her mum knows she'll grow up strong if she understands her cultural heritage and can contribute to her Torres Strait Islander community. Living in the city, Alira's mum understands growing up away from the Torres Strait means connection to culture depends on opportunities through places like school and community groups. By the time she's 4, Alira's dad's taking her to shows and exhibitions to teach her about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. Through teaching from her family, Alira learns about her clan and the stories of her family history. By the time she's 13, both Alira and her dad believe she'll grow up strong as part of her family and by learning her culture. So on the one hand, Alira's story is very different from Mason's. So they're different in aspects like connection to country. Mason's got a close physical connection to country. Alira lives a long way away from the Torres Strait. But on the other hand, there are consistencies between these stories. So regardless of the fact that Alira is a long way from the Torres Strait, her family used their family connections and their broader connection to community and culture to ensure that Alira is able to grow up strong as a Torres Strait Islander girl. So amidst these differences, we also see really important commonalities. And it's these commonalities that Kristin and our other colleagues then started to listen to and think about how we could use them in relation to quantitative analysis of LSIC data. So to be clear, in the stories that we've been telling here, we're not just making the meaning of study children and families available to other people. We're also remaking meaning. As you could see what we did with Mason's story, there were times where we made decisions about what to share, what to keep hidden. There were times where we decided to add in additional detail to highlight elements of culture. So we're not just telling a story, we're not just making a story that already exists, we're also remaking meaning through the process that we've been through. And we do this for all sorts of intentional ways. But the other aspect that we need to be clear about that, people like Phillips and Bunda in their book on storying make clear is that when we do this kind of work, stories are acts of analysis. They're acts of analysis because we select data, we interpret that data, we invoke theory, in our case, the model of social and emotional well-being, and we craft stories to make meaning. But having done this, having engaged in this analytical but also meaning-making process, we're then in a position where this type of analysis can be used to guide other types of analysis, such as the forms of quantitative analysis that Kristin and her colleagues specialise in. And I'm going to hand over to Kristin now to talk through how that process worked.
Thanks, Stuart. So my name's Kristin Lawrence, and I'm a non-Indigenous Australian of European heritage, and I'm joining you today from Queensland University of Technology on the lands of the Turrbal and Yuggera peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to those of the lands that you join the webinar from today. And I also acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on today's webinar, and the 1,700 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people and families who share their knowledges and experiences so generously each year as part of the LSIC study. So as Stuart mentioned, my training's in Western quantitative methods. So I'm someone who's used to working with information that's been measured, counted, and expressed as numbers rather than words. And a lot of the information available in LSIC has been provided in that way. And the storying work that Tirritpa and Stuart have been describing to you was something brand new to me when we came to this report. And working together with them and the other members of the Early Childhood Report for the LSIC study has been such a wonderful learning experience for me. And I'm really grateful to be able to share some of that journey with you today. So I'm going to spend the next few slides talking to you about how we used the themes that were emerging from the stories Stuart and Tirritpa were generating to guide the development of the questions that we asked of the quantitative data in the study. And this was our way of trying to ensure that our analyses reflected the experiences that were important to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants in the study, and were also useful to the other stakeholders who need information about how we can help kids grow up strongly right from their early years. So our policy makers, our early childhood educators and carers, and of course people such as yourselves who focus on strengthening families and communities. And as a team, we had regular and deep yarns together about how we were approaching the information shared by the young people and their families within the study. And we were really conscious of grounding our work in strengths-based approaches that had previously been developed by and with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And so one of the key models that centred our work on this project was Gian Dudgeon's holistic model of social and emotional wellbeing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and many of you will be familiar with this model and how it holistically reflects the wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as reflecting connections in 7 areas of life. And these include being connected to body and behaviour, to mind and emotions, but also goes beyond that and includes connections to family and kinship, community, culture, country, and to ancestors and spirituality. And rather than looking at each of these connections as an isolated experience, we wanted to come up with a way of using the numbers in the study to reflect this holistic understanding of well-being. So guided by that model and our strength-based approach to the data, we decided that one of the measures we'd use in our study would count up the number of these areas of connection that children experienced, so that we could ask questions about which experiences in early childhood made it more likely that children would experience strong and holistic well-being as they grew up. So in the original model there, you can see the 7 areas of connection. However, we were working with information that had already been collected from study participants rather than going out and collecting the information new for ourselves. And so our first step was to look and see which questions were asked of young people and family within each of these connections. And we were fortunate that colleagues at the Australian National University had already done quite a bit of work with the data to identify questions in the study that measured connections in these areas. And based on their work, we knew that there were lots of questions measuring those 4 areas of connection on the right of the image, but unfortunately there were fewer questions asking about the other 3 areas of connection on the left of the image, despite us knowing that those are also important areas of connection. And so that meant we actually had to combine those 3 areas together into one, now encompassing connection to culture, country, ancestors, and spirit. So our social and emotional wellbeing model in the study is an adapted version of Gian Dudgeon's original model, where we're drawing on information now across 5 areas of connection in total. So Stuart, if you can go to the next slide. people will be able to see examples of the types of information that the research team at ANU were able to show could be used together to measure each of the different areas of social emotional wellbeing connections. And in each area, you can see that we're using multiple pieces of information to capture as broad a range of experiences within that connection as we could. Stuart, if we can go to the next slide. Now, for our report, we're interested in being able to show which early childhood experiences helped children to grow up strongly into later life. And we had information available from the first 14 years of data gathered within the study. And so we were actually able to look at two different periods of children's later lives. And these are periods that are associated with different experiences, different roles and responsibilities as children age. And so the first of these we defined as in middle childhood, where we looked at information provided by study participants and their families and teachers when they are aged about 10 to 12 years and were completing the senior years of primary school. We are also able to look at a second period later in life during adolescence, when children were aged between 14 and 16 years of age and completing years 8 to 10 of high school. And in each of these periods, we had at least 2 years of data available to describe children's experiences, and sometimes we even had between 3 and 5 years worth of information to combine within each of those periods. Now, to represent young people's social and emotional wellbeing within each of these periods, we counted up the number of areas out of the 5 in our model in which children experienced the connection. And we did this in each of the middle childhood and the adolescent periods so that we could see if the experiences were stable or changing across time. And if Stuart can progress the slide, thanks, we'll see that, many of the kids there in middle childhood and in adolescence actually experience connection in all 5 of those areas of the wellbeing model, about 4 in 10 during middle childhood, increasing to almost 5 in 10 during adolescence. Another large portion of kids are experiencing connections on all but one of those 5 areas, so about 3 in 10 in each period. And then a smaller portion of children, just over 1 in 10 in each period, had 3 areas of connection. And finally, around 1 in 10 children had 2 or fewer areas of connection. So our analyses focused on comparing which early childhood experiences increased the likelihood that children would experience strong connections, so that is having all 5 areas connected or 4 of the 5 areas connected in middle childhood and in adolescence, relative to just 1 or 2 areas of connection. So Stuart, next slide. When we were looking at early childhood experiences that related to strong later wellbeing and other experiences of strength in middle childhood and adolescence, we looked at 2 different periods in early childhood. And one of these focused on about the first 5 years of life before kids commenced formal schooling. And much of the information in this period was provided by the child's primary caregiver, which was most typically the child's mum, but with additional information gained from another carer, typically the child's dad. We also looked at experiences in the first couple of years after children had started at primary school, which is a big transition that kids make during the later years of early childhood. And again, a lot of the information here was coming from the children's main caregivers, but we also now had information that was provided by children's teachers. Now, as for the middle childhood and adolescent periods, we were able to draw on multiple years or waves of data from the study within each of these early childhood periods. And as the kids became older, more and more information was gathered directly from the young people themselves, in addition to the information provided by carers and teachers. And next slide. So what we did was be guided by what Stuart and Tirritpa had identified in their stories of children's experiences of growing up strongly, to look at a range of early childhood experiences. And for example, this included opportunities to participate in cultural experiences such as traditional arts, dancing, painting, attending cultural events, traditional practices like fishing or hunting. But we also looked at children's experience of connection to country during early childhood, at their opportunity to speak an Indigenous language or languages, their identity and sense of belonging to mob, as well as information about parents' wellbeing and the availability of support networks among family and friends for parents. And we looked at early home learning experiences, such as parents spending time in activities like playing or reading or telling stories with their child, as well as children's attendance at formal playgroups and preschool programs. And so we analysed our data to see how those early experiences related to a variety of later experiences in middle childhood and adolescence, including children's social emotional wellbeing, their engagement at school, their academic learning and thinking skills, and their confidence in using digital technology. And for each of those experiences, we also looked at how these varied depending on where kids lived, because we often found that there were different stories of growing up strongly among children living in major cities, in regional areas, and those in remote areas of Australia, which of course has important implications for how we can support kids in different areas of Australia to grow up strongly. So I'm going to hand back to Stuart to take you through a quick and dirty look at some of our findings.
Thanks, Kristin. And I will move through these findings in a relatively rapid manner, but at the end of towards the end of the presentation, we'll represent that QR code that connects to our report, where you'll be able to see these findings in details. So once Kristin and her colleagues had done all this work, we were able to see the fruits of the labour of telling these stories in the first instance, listening to these stories, and then responding to them with quantitative analysis. We were able to see the benefits of listening to stories about culture and understand why culture is important, and then see how many children are getting access to cultural participation opportunities during early childhood, but also getting a sense that this is not evenly distributed across different parts of the continent, as Kristin mentioned. We can see that amongst those children who have connection to culture from their early childhood, they're much more significantly likely to have stronger social and emotional well-being during middle childhood and adolescence. Similarly, around connection to mob, we listened to stories about the importance of that connection and could see that many children were getting that connection from the early childhood period, but again, that there were differences across different parts of the continent. Amongst those children who had that connection, they had stronger social and emotional well-being during early childhood, but it continued and was sustained across both middle childhood and adolescence. So these early connections are really critical. Likewise for connection to country. Again, we see large proportion of children having connection to country during their early childhood period, although this is less than half once we get to children who are living in major cities. We can also see that while the early childhood period is really important for making these connections, there are also opportunities later in life to forge these really important connections. So we know while 64% of kids were getting a connection to country during early childhood, that had ultimately increased by adolescence to 74%. So change over time is possible while also recognising that critical window during early childhood. Most children were connected to country at some stage across their childhood through to adolescence, and where this happened in early childhood, children were more likely to have stronger social and emotional well-being, both in middle childhood and adolescence. There is an equivalent story about language, but the distribution is quite different. So with language, we are seeing relatively few children forming a connection during their early childhood, especially once we move out of very remote parts of Australia. And critically, we see that connection to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages changing over time and changing, unfortunately, in a declining trajectory. So while 18% of kids speak an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander language during early childhood, and this is maintained into middle childhood, this drops off into adolescence. And we can see that places like high schools are therefore really critical to language preservation efforts. Amongst those children who do speak an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander language during early childhood, they're much more likely to maintain social and emotional wellbeing across both middle childhood and adolescence. So language preservation and revitalisation is not just about preserving the unique linguistic diversity of this continent, but it's also about public health and promoting wellbeing. Turning to family and kinship, we know from the stories that were told with LSIC data that these are really important. And once we look at the data, we can see that it's not just a nuclear family, but also a broad kinship network that's providing support for parents during the early childhood period. Amongst those parents who have this broad network of support, their children are more likely to be able to manage emotions during early schooling, be engaged, have higher academic results, and stronger social and emotional well-being. Parents who themselves have stronger well-being during their early childhood years are much more likely to spend time at home in activities with their children, feel more confident with their parenting, show more warmth and care, and use less harsh discipline. And we know this has positive outcomes for kids in the forms of better overall health, early learning, higher school engagement, and social and emotional well-being. So overall, we can see through this synthesis of stories that we've told using LSIC data and then quantitative analysis from listening to those stories that there are many ways in which we can promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids to grow up strong. The kids themselves have told us this once they become teenagers. And our colleague Jessa Rogers, a Wiradjuri scholar, has pieced together some of the responses that these children have given us about growing up strong, which they told us when they were in adolescence. This here is represented as a poem that culminates with, "You have learnt to be a good person and be safe, strong and brave." So when we listen to stories in this project, we can see how we have listened ultimately to stories of strength and how the use of stories is an act of strength. We see storying as an Indigenous way of doing longitudinal research. We see stories as a way of helping us to ensure that we do research the right ways by focusing on what works for mob rather than looking at things that work against the interests of mob. We tell stories to guide what's important for us to study. And Kristin and her colleagues have shown us in an incredibly powerful way how we can and should use stories to guide statistical analysis. And we can tell stories so that people understand what's essential. The numbers are important. They get us across those 1,700 kids. But the stories tell us why those numbers are meaningful. We don't think these stories of strength are over, and we would like to invite you to be part of the ongoing telling of stories of strength using the longitudinal study of Indigenous children. It is an underutilised resource. Anyone can apply to the Department of Social Services for access, and if granted access, you will find a wealth of information around parenting, relationships, education, health, culture and community. So you could build on our report. The QR code on the screen will take you to that report and use LSIC data to continue these stories of strength. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Stuart, Tirritpa and Kristin. Really inspiring work and really great to see how data, Indigenous knowledge and storytelling can all come together in a really powerful way to do research, like you just said. So yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. We have got 1 minute to go, and I was just wondering if anybody did have a question that they wanted to ask Stuart, Tirritpa, or Kristin before we finish up. I'll just ask one question. So how do you see communities and practitioners, or even the LSIC families themselves, using the insights that you found so far? And do you see a potential for the story-based findings to support stronger communities or influence policy moving forward?
I'm happy to start tackling that one. I think one of the things that that report, that newspaper article that Tirritpa showed at the start, is a really important reminder that the report that we've produced is not telling our communities anything that they don't already know. But what I think is critical about this report is it gives information back to community so that they can advocate for what they need. And one of the things that I think we're increasingly recognizing is the importance of place-based approaches. We're seeing in this data that the same approach isn't going to work in major cities as it would in, say, very remote parts of the continent. So now I think communities have a resource to start advocating for the types of things that they need in their local communities. I don't know if Kristin or Tirritpa have thoughts about the other parts of your question, Lisa.
I'll just build upon that. I think just for example there, that discussion around language, and language not only just being for the cultivation and maintaining of the language itself, but the impact on health and well-being, and the ways in which the strengths that children come with in terms of language and syntax, just as one example.
Look, I think they've both covered it really well, but I think one of the things that's really impressive about this study is that they've maintained really high engagement with families over time. And one of the ways in which they do that is to be very conscious of handing back to communities information produced in the reports. And so one of the fact sheets that we produced, it actually describes information for participants and families. And Stuart and Tirritpa are currently working with an Aboriginal artist to create some story cards that bring those stories back. And we hope that those will be mailed out to families so that families get to see that, that what they're telling us is actually getting into the hands of policymakers, getting into the hands of educators, getting into the hands of early child carers, getting into the hands of people who can make a difference for families and communities.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to seeing those resources. So thank you again so much for your presentation, and thank you to everybody who came along today, and your lovely comments in the chat there as well. We hope that today's session has sparked some new reflection for everybody, for your own practice, and potentially using stories, I guess, as another way of using the data to actually give the data depth, I guess. So this session, I think there was a question earlier around will the session be recorded? And yes, it will be recorded. So it has been recorded, and we'll make this available in the next coming days. It'll be found on our website, along with all the other webinars from this series as well. So if you are interested in having a look at any of the ones that we've presented in the last few months, they'll all be up on our website for you to have a look at. So on behalf of FRSA, I'd just like to thank you again, Stuart, Tirritpa and Kristin, and everybody for being a part of today's webinar. And yeah, hope you have a really great afternoon. Thanks, heaps.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.